"You should have left him at home." Those were the words my mother whispered to my father, just loud enough for me to hear. My grandfather heard them too. I watched his shoulders stiffen for just a second before he quietly smiled and adjusted the sleeves of his faded blue jacket. He pretended nothing happened. That hurt more than if he'd argued. I still remember standing beside him in the enormous ballroom of the Hilton downtown, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and people wearing suits that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. It was my father's company's annual leadership gala, the biggest event of the year. Executives, investors, board members, their spouses, even reporters. My father had spent weeks talking about how important this night was. "This is where careers are made," he told everyone. Apparently, families could be destroyed there too. Grandpa had arrived wearing the only suit he owned. It wasn't expensive. The jacket had been tailored years ago. The cuffs were slightly shiny from age. His shoes had been polished so carefully I could still smell the wax. He looked proud, not flashy, just dignified. Mom looked horrified. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You couldn't buy him something better?" Dad sighed. I offered. Grandpa smiled gently. "I told him not to waste his money." Mom forced a laugh. "Well, people are going to think." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Grandpa knew exactly what she meant. So did I. "My name is Ethan. I'm 24 years old. Growing up, Grandpa practically raised me. My parents worked constantly. Dad chased promotions. Mom chased appearances. Grandpa chased neither. He simply showed up. School plays, baseball games, doctor appointments, late-night homework, broken hearts. He was always there. Every birthday card I ever received from him ended with the same sentence. Character lasts longer than success. Back then, I thought it was just something old people said. Years later, I'd realized it was a warning. People assumed Grandpa had failed at life. He'd worked as a janitor for almost 40 years. Elementary schools, libraries, office buildings. He retired quietly at 68. No retirement party. No newspaper article. No fancy watch. Just a cardboard box with a coffee mug and a framed picture of me. Dad hated telling people what Grandpa had done. Whenever someone asked about his father, he'd quickly change the subject. If they pressed, he worked in maintenance, never janitor, as if the word itself was contagious. Inside the ballroom, waiters floated between guests carrying champagne. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Massive company banners hung from the ceiling. Everything screamed money. Dad immediately transformed. His posture changed. His smile widened. His voice became louder. Networking mode. He disappeared into groups of executives, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. Mom wasn't far behind. She loved these events. Every compliment about her dress made her stand a little taller. Meanwhile, Grandpa and I found a quiet table near the back. He looked around with genuine curiosity. "They sure spent a lot decorating." I laughed. "You sound impressed." "I am." "You don't think it's excessive?" He smiled. "People can spend their money however they want." Then he leaned closer. "I just hope they treat the staff kindly." That was Grandpa, always noticing the people nobody else saw. He thanked every waiter, held doors open, picked up a napkin another guest had dropped. "Tiny acts, you know how parents are." She waved her hand dismissively. "He still insists on calling himself a janitor." Then she smiled in that fake way she always did around rich people. "We've tried convincing him to say facilities manager." Grandpa looked confused. "But I was a janitor." Mom forced another laugh. "It's just..." She lowered her voice. "It sounds better." Grandpa quietly replied, "I've never been ashamed of honest work." The executives exchanged awkward glances. Within seconds, they excused themselves. Dad's face turned bright red. The moment they walked away, Dad exploded. "What was that?" Grandpa blinked. "What?" "You embarrassed me." I answered his question. "You didn't have to say janitor." Grandpa frowned. "But that's what I was." Dad leaned closer. "Do you have any idea how important tonight is?" People nearby had started watching. Mom joined in. "You always do this." Grandpa looked genuinely hurt. "Do what?" "You make people uncomfortable." "I don't understand." Dad clenched his jaw. "You never learned how this world works." Grandpa stayed quiet. Dad continued. "This company is full of high achievers. They don't relate to..." He stopped himself. Grandpa finished the sentence. People like me? Dad said nothing. His silence answered everything. I stood up. Dad, enough. He pointed at me. Stay out of this. No. He's your father. Dad scoffed. And he spent decades working, so you could become who you are. Mom rolled her eyes. Don't start with the emotional speeches. Grandpa touched my arm. It's all right. No. It wasn't. Not even close. To make matters worse, Dad suddenly spotted someone across the ballroom. His face went pale. The CEO's here. Everyone straightened instinctively. The CEO rarely attended regional events. Rumors said he only appeared when something significant was happening. Executives practically sprinted toward the entrance. Dad adjusted his tie. Mom fixed her makeup using her phone camera. Then Dad looked at Grandpa. You know what? Maybe you should head home. I couldn't believe what I'd heard. Grandpa smiled sadly. If that's best. He actually started reaching for his coat. Something inside me snapped. No. I grabbed the coat first. You're staying. Dad glared at me. I said. I heard you. People were staring now. Dad lowered his voice. For once in your life, don't create a scene. I almost laughed. He thought I was the one creating the scene. The ballroom doors opened. Every conversation stopped. The CEO entered with several board members behind him. Tall, gray-haired, calm. He wasn't flashy. Grandpa's eyes narrowed. He whispered to himself, Roosevelt. Then suddenly he looked up. The boy who always stayed in the library. Daniel's smile became even wider. Grandpa smiled. I figured you liked reading. Daniel shook his head. I hated reading. Soft laughter spread through the room. I stayed because the building was warm. Another pause. And because I knew you'd leave half your dinner on the table. Grandpa looked embarrassed. Oh. Daniel smiled. You thought I never noticed. I noticed every sandwich. Every apple. Every carton of milk. You'd clean the hallway. Walk past. And suddenly there'd be food sitting on the table. You never once said it was for me. Grandpa quietly replied. I didn't want you to feel ashamed. I glanced at my parents. Mom's eyes were fixed on the floor. Dad looked frozen. Daniel wasn't finished. One winter, I stopped coming. Grandpa looked concerned. I remember. You disappeared. Daniel nodded. My mother got sick. We lost our apartment. We were living in our car. Gasps echoed around the room. I thought nobody cared. He looked at Grandpa again. But somehow, you found us. Grandpa blinked. I asked around. Daniel smiled. You asked every teacher, every student, the crossing guard, the mailman. You searched for 2 weeks. Grandpa shrugged modestly. I was worried. Daniel's voice cracked. You brought blankets. You brought groceries. And you paid for a motel. Grandpa immediately shook his head. It wasn't much. It was everything. Daniel answered. Someone near the front quietly wiped away tears. Even the waitstaff had stopped working. Daniel continued. My mother asked why a stranger would do that. You know what you told her? Grandpa laughed softly. I honestly don't remember. Daniel never looked away from him. You said, nobody should feel invisible. Grandpa stared at him, as if hearing words he'd forgotten decades ago. My father suddenly spoke. Dad! Grandpa looked over. You never told us any of this. Grandpa smiled gently. There wasn't much to tell. Daniel raised his hand. It doesn't end there. The applause slowly faded. When I graduated from business school, I came back to Roosevelt. I wanted to thank him. They told me he'd retired. I spent years searching. I hired investigators. I checked employment records. I even posted notices online. He laughed. You know what happened? Grandpa smiled sheepishly. I've never owned a computer. More laughter filled the room. I know. Daniel smiled. It took 20 years. And tonight, I finally found you. A board member walked over quietly. Daniel, the ceremony? Daniel shook his head. It can wait. Then he looked at Grandpa. I've waited 20 years. I'm not rushing this. He turned toward everyone gathered. Most people think success comes from ambition. They're wrong. Success comes from kindness that somebody refuses to forget. He pointed gently toward Grandpa. This man never managed a corporation. He never owned stock. He never chased titles. But he built leaders. He simply didn't know it. Dad looked physically sick. One of his coworkers whispered something to another executive. Both glanced toward him. Whatever respect he'd been trying to earn all night was evaporating. Not because Grandpa had been a janitor. Because everyone had seen how he treated him. Daniel looked back at Grandpa. I've dreamed about this moment. Grandpa chuckled nervously. I think you're giving me too much credit. Daniel smiled. No. I've spent decades trying to become the kind of man you already were. Then Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. It looked older than I was. Carefully, he unfolded a faded piece of paper protected inside a plastic sleeve. The paper was yellow with age. The edges were... I've never taken it out. Grandpa's hands began to tremble. I couldn't see what was written on the paper. Neither could anyone else. Daniel carefully handed it to him. As Grandpa unfolded it Dad stopped. He couldn't seem to force the words out. For the first time in my life, I saw my father speechless. Grandpa rescued him. It's all right. No. Dad said. It isn't. His voice cracked. I've spent years pretending your job embarrassed me. I was wrong. Grandpa smiled sadly. I know. Those 2 words hit harder than any speech could have. I know. Not I forgive you. Not it's okay. Just, I know. Because Grandpa had known all along. Every time Dad introduced him as maintenance. Every time Mom changed the subject. Every time they avoided inviting him to work events. He had known. He had simply chosen to love them anyway. Mom stepped forward next. Dad! She had always called him Dad after marrying into the family. Tonight, the words sounded different. I never meant. Grandpa looked at her gently. You wanted your husband to succeed. That's understandable. She shook her head. No. I cared too much about appearances. Tears rolled down her face. I thought people judged us. Daniel spoke quietly. They did. Everyone looked at him. They judged your husband. They judged your character. Not your father. The sentence landed like a hammer. One of Dad's vice presidents approached. Mark! He glanced toward Grandpa. You never told us your father was the man Daniel has been talking about for years. Dad looked confused. What do you mean? The vice president blinked. The CEO tells this story every Christmas. Every head turned toward Daniel. Daniel smiled. I've told it for 19 years. I never knew his name. Daniel walked onto the stage. He picked up the microphone. I think tonight's schedule needs to change. The audience laughed softly. I was supposed to announce this year's Leadership Excellence Award. He smiled toward Grandpa. I've changed my mind. Everyone exchanged confused looks. The award still has a recipient. But before that, I'd like everyone to stand. More confusion. Slowly, hundreds of people rose from their seats. Executives, investors, managers, employees, everyone. Daniel looked toward my grandfather. This standing ovation isn't for a CEO. It isn't for record profits. It isn't for someone with a fancy title. It's for a man who spent 40 years reminding people that dignity exists in every honest job. The applause exploded. It was louder than before. Longer. People weren't clapping politely anymore. Some were crying openly. Others whistled. A few employees shouted, "Thank you, Mr. Henry." Grandpa looked completely overwhelmed. He whispered to me, "I've never had people clap for me." I smiled through tears. They're 40 years late. After several minutes, Daniel raised his hand again. The applause slowly faded. I also owe everyone an explanation. He looked toward the board members. This company believes leadership starts with respect. What is it? Daniel handed him the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. Grandpa stared at it. His hands froze. I leaned closer. The number made my stomach drop. $2 million. Grandpa immediately tried to hand it back. Oh, absolutely not. Daniel smiled. Yes. No. I can't accept this. You already did. Grandpa looked confused. What? 40 years ago. When you spent money you couldn't afford on a frightened teenager. You invested in me. This is simply your return. The ballroom erupted into stunned whispers. $2 million. For a janitor. Dad looked ready to collapse. Mom grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. Grandpa shook his head over and over. I helped because it was the right thing. I wasn't expecting anything. I know, Daniel said. That's exactly why you deserve it. Grandpa slowly closed the envelope. Then, to everyone's surprise, he handed it back. Daniel frowned. You don't want it? Grandpa smiled. I don't need $2 million. Daniel blinked. You earned it. I know. But someone else probably needs it more. The room fell silent again. Grandpa continued. If you really want to honor me, create scholarships for kids who feel invisible. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. You'd give away $2 million? Grandpa chuckled. I've lived a wonderful life. I have enough. I always had enough. Even Daniel couldn't answer immediately. Finally, he smiled. Then we'll do both. Grandpa laughed. What do you mean? You'll accept enough to enjoy your retirement. And the rest? He turned toward the audience. We'll create the Henry Grant Foundation. Thunderous applause filled the ballroom again. Daniel continued. Every year, it will help students facing poverty. And every scholarship letter will include your note. Grandpa covered his face with one hand. I don't know what to say. Daniel smiled warmly. You already said it 40 years ago. I thought the night couldn't become more emotional. I was wrong. Because, just as everyone began celebrating, a member of the board quietly walked over to Daniel and whispered something into his ear. Daniel's smile faded. He nodded once, then looked directly at my father. Mark! We need to talk. Not tomorrow. Not privately. Right there. In front of everyone. And the look on Daniel's face told me this conversation wasn't about my grandfather anymore. It was about my father. The applause slowly faded until the ballroom was quiet again. Every eye shifted from my grandfather to my father. Dad looked as if he already knew what was coming. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked disappointed. And somehow, that felt much worse. He stepped down from the stage and stood a few feet in front of my father. Mark! Dad swallowed. Yes, sir. Daniel folded his hands. I've spent 23 years trying to build a company where every employee is treated with dignity. I know, Dad replied quietly. I've personally visited offices after hours just to thank the janitorial teams. I know. I've spoken at every leadership summit about respecting people regardless of their title. I know. Daniel tilted his head. Do you? The question hung in the air, because everyone in that ballroom had just watched Dad treat the very kind of person Daniel had built the company's values around as an embarrassment. There was no excuse, no misunderstanding, no spin, just the truth. Daniel looked toward the audience. When someone reveals their character, believe them. He turned back to Dad. Tonight, I didn't discover that your father was a janitor. I discovered that one of my senior leaders still believes some jobs make people less worthy of respect. Dad looked down at the floor. I was wrong. Daniel nodded. I believe you know that now. But leadership isn't measured by what we say after we're caught. It's measured by what we do when no one is watching. The sentence landed heavily. I noticed several board members quietly nodding. Dad finally looked up. I don't deserve to defend myself. No, Daniel replied. You don't. Another long silence. Then something happened I never expected. Dad walked over to Grandpa. Not halfway. All the way. In front of hundreds of people. He slowly dropped to one knee. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. My father, who had spent his entire life protecting his image, did something no one thought he was capable of. He cried. Real tears. Dad! His voice shook. I've been ashamed of the wrong person. Grandpa immediately tried to pull him back to his feet. Mark! No. Dad said. Please. Let me say this. He took a deep breath. When I was a kid, I hated that you came to school in your work clothes. I hated when my friends saw you pushing that mop. I thought they were laughing at you. He paused. They weren't. They were laughing at me. I spent the next 40 years trying to outrun that feeling. His shoulders trembled, And somewhere along the way, I forgot who carried me on those shoulders. The room was completely still. I forgot who worked double shifts so I could go to college. I forgot who skipped buying himself a winter coat so I could have my first computer. I forgot who taught me never to lie. His voice cracked. And then I lied about you. He looked directly into Grandpa's eyes. I'm sorry. Not for tonight. For everything. Grandpa reached down and gently lifted his son to his feet. I forgave you years ago. Dad stared at him. You did? Grandpa smiled. The hardest thing about being a parent is watching your child become someone you don't recognize. But you never stop loving them. Dad completely broke down. The two of them hugged for what felt like forever. People throughout the ballroom quietly wiped away tears. Even some of the executives who had spent their careers hiding emotion weren't pretending anymore. Mom slowly approached. She looked smaller somehow. Less polished. Less perfect. More human. She stopped in front of Grandpa. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. Grandpa smiled warmly. None of us deserve it. That's why it's called forgiveness. She began crying. I cared so much about what strangers thought that I stopped seeing the people who mattered. Grandpa gently squeezed her hand. Then don't waste another day. Daniel waited until the room settled before speaking again. I've made a decision. Everyone looked toward him. Mark! Dad straightened instinctively. I am not terminating your employment. A ripple of surprise spread across the ballroom. Dad looked stunned. Daniel continued, but effective immediately. You are stepping down from your executive role. The room fell silent again. You'll spend the next 6 months working in every department that keeps this company running. Dad blinked. You'll work with housekeeping, facilities, security, the cafeteria, mail services, maintenance. You'll learn every name. You'll hear every story. And when you return to leadership, if you return, it will be because you've earned the right to lead people, not manage them. Dad didn't argue. He simply nodded. I understand. Daniel smiled faintly. I hope you do. One of the board members spoke up. I support the decision. Another nodded. So do I. Within moments, every board member had agreed. Not because they wanted to punish Dad, because they wanted to protect the culture they'd spent years building. The rest of the evening unfolded differently than anyone had planned. The awards ceremony became a celebration of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Daniel invited the housekeeping staff onto the stage, then the maintenance crews, the security officers, the kitchen employees. One by one, people who normally entered through the back doors stood beneath the bright lights while executives applauded them. I glanced at Grandpa. He looked happier watching them than he had when everyone applauded him. That was who he was. He never wanted attention. He wanted people to feel seen. Over the next few months, everything changed. Dad kept his word. He worked alongside the janitorial team. The first week, people whispered. By the third week, they talked. Not because he was an executive, because he actually listened. He learned that Maria, who cleaned the 4th floor every night, was paying her daughter's nursing school tuition. He learned that Frank in maintenance had invented a scheduling system that saved thousands of dollars, but nobody had ever asked for his ideas. He learned that the security guard who greeted him every morning had once served 2 tours overseas. People he'd walked past for years suddenly had names, families, dreams, stories. Dad later told me that those 6 months taught him more about leadership than his MBA ever had. Mom changed too. She stopped chasing invitations to exclusive events. Instead, every Thursday, she volunteered at the Community Literacy Center. The same one Grandpa had quietly supported for years without telling anyone. She admitted something to me one afternoon. I spent so much of my life trying to impress successful people. I forgot successful people aren't always impressive. As for Grandpa, he reluctantly accepted enough money to repair his small house, replace his 20-year-old pickup truck, and finally take the train trip across the country he dreamed about since he was young. The rest went exactly where he wanted it. The Henry Grant Foundation awarded its first scholarships the following spring. The recipients weren't chosen solely for grades. They were chosen for resilience, for kindness, for refusing to give up. Every acceptance letter included the same note that Daniel had carried in his wallet for 40 years. The world needs honest people more than impressive people. Those words spread farther than Grandpa ever imagined. Teachers framed them. Students shared them online. Companies quoted them in leadership seminars. But Grandpa still insisted he wasn't anyone special. About a year later, Daniel invited our family to the company's new headquarters. He wanted Grandpa to see something. Near the front entrance stood a bronze plaque. Not a giant statue, not a glamorous monument, just a simple plaque where every employee passed each morning. It read, "In honor of Henry Carter, janitor, mentor, leader." He reminded us that no honest job is small and no person is invisible. Beneath it were Grandpa's words, "Character lasts longer than success." Grandpa stared at it for a long time. Finally, he laughed. "You know, I still think janitor was a pretty good job." Daniel smiled. "I know. It helped build this company." Grandpa passed away peacefully 3 years later. He was 91. At his funeral, the church overflowed. Former students came. Teachers came. Neighbors came. The scholarship recipients came. Janitors from schools all over the state came, wearing their work uniforms. Daniel sat in the front row. So did every member of the company's executive team. When it was my turn to speak, I looked around the room. Then I smiled. My grandfather cleaned floors. I paused. But that was never the most important thing he cleaned. People looked at me curiously. He cleaned away the idea that someone's worth comes from their paycheck. He cleaned away loneliness. He cleaned away hopelessness. And every person who met him left a little better than they arrived. I looked at my father. He was crying openly. He used to tell me that character lasts longer than success. I finally understand what he meant. Because promotions end. Titles change. Money comes and goes. But the way you make people feel, that becomes part of who they are forever. Sometimes I visit the company headquarters. I always stop at that bronze plaque. Without fail, someone is standing there reading it. New employees, visitors, interns, cleaning staff, executives. They all pause for a moment before walking inside. And every time I see that, I think back to the night my parents called my grandfather an embarrassing janitor. They thought his job defined him. They couldn't have been more wrong. His job paid the bills. His character changed lives. And in the end, that was the only title anyone truly remembered.